Secularism, and the speaker is here. I welcome Professor Bilgrami as well. I'll just briefly introduce what APPSC is, and then we will proceed further. Ambedkar Periyar Pune Study Circle, IIT Bombay, is an independent and political collective of students from various disciplines in the institute. We hope to create an intellectual platform to think through and discuss social, political and economic issues through the ideas of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Periyar, Jyotirao Phule and Savitribai Phule. APPSC was formally put together in 2015. Since then, we have worked in the campus to strengthen the values of justice, liberty and equality upheld by the Constitution. We have initiated and promoted healthy discussions and debates among the campus community about social political issues such as caste, patriarchy, communalism, pseudoscience, etc. We have been organizing reading sessions, public lectures and talks, panel discussions, film screenings and so on with the aim of strengthening the democratic spirit of the campus. In the past, we have campaigned against the skewed gender ratio on campus, casual sexism, anti-democratic rules of the campus elections. We recently participated in the protest against the massive fee hike under the banner of Students Against Fee Hike. We encourage students to join us to have active conversation and to build support networks to overcome systematic discriminations and injustice. We urge students from marginalized communities as well as others to be politically aware and scientific. We believe that to be able to engage with and respond to political events happening around is a very essential part of higher education. Thank you. Now I request Amar Khan to introduce Professor Bilgrami.
Hi. It's such a pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Professor Akeel Bilgrami is an Indian philosopher of international eminence and influence. He graduated from the University of Bombay in 1970 and went to the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. Thereafter, he moved to the United States and earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. He currently holds the Sidney Morgenbesser Chair in Philosophy at Columbia University, New York. He was the chairman of Columbia's philosophy department from 1994 to 1998. He was the director of the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia from 2004 to 2011. Bilgrami's writing spans the philosophy of language and the mind, as well as political and moral philosophy. His books include Belief and Meaning, 92, Self-Knowledge and Resentment, 2006, Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, 2014, Gandhi the Philosopher, 2022, and What is a Muslim, 2022. Bilgrami's work, even when it is philosophical, is not an ivory tower philosopher's engagement with abstract ideas, but stems from his deep socio-political and moral concerns. His widely admired and highly influential writings on Gandhi, Marx, alienation, secularism, identity, liberalism, and populism provide deep and significant insights on these subjects. We welcome you, Professor.
Thank you. It's nice to be back. Very glad to be speaking in a forum where Ambedkar put his name. In fact, I've just finished a long essay on Ambedkar and Gandhi, and it would be much more appropriate, I suppose, for this forum and this audience, but I was asked to speak on secularism, so I'll do that. I want to argue for two claims. One is the relatively counter-intuitive claim that I don't believe that secularism was a significant concept in India until the 1980s. We seem to be under the impression that it was after the 1980s when it became very present and important concept. We seem to be under the impression that it was always around for the whole of the 20th century. But in fact, nobody spoke of secularism, not even then. Pretty much just around partition, when obviously with the acrimonies around partition, somebody is bound to have spoken about it. So I want to diagnose that, analyze why it is that secularism had no particular motivating, urgent concern for the Indian population or for the leaders of the nationalist movement, including the most prominent of them, Nehru and Gandhi. So that's what I want to diagnose first. And then say why after the 1980s it became a very pressing, very urgent, and rightly an issue that concerns us all to this day. The second thing I want to argue is that there is a view which was first articulated, if Habib tells me it was first articulated by Radhakrishnan, but I first read it in a long essay by Amartya Sen. And now, of course, every academic in the political social sciences is mouthing it like a mantra, that there's this peculiar kind of Indian secularism which is different from Western secularism. Amartya Sen said it in an essay called Secularism and Its Discontents or something like that. And Irfan tells me that Radhakrishnan had said it first. Well, whoever said it first, everybody's saying it now, and it's wrong. Or so am I. I believe secularism in India, when it was adopted after independence, was just nothing but European secularism. And I'm trying to say how it differed in the margins from European secularism, but not in its fundamental elements. Okay, so those are the two goals that I have for this talk. So I don't think you can understand Indian secularism until you understand European nationalism. There is no way to understand what happened, why in India secularism was not significant until pretty much the partition, mid-40s, and became highly significant after 1980s. Unless you go back to Europe and ask the question, what is the genealogy? What maybe prompted people to talk about secularism in the first place, historically, in Europe, where it was first articulated? What prompted secularism in Europe? Until you understand that, you won't understand why it wasn't significant in India until relatively late and gave significant, great pressing urgency in the last 4 decades. So let's ask the genealogical question. Whence secularism? What are its origins in Europe? Now, you must understand that in 17th century Europe, great changes came with the rise of modern science. With the rise of modern science, the concept of the state became something whose standard age-old justification in Europe lapsed. The age-old justification for the state was that the monarch, king or queen, who personified the state, had a divine right to the laws of the state, to the high office of the state. That was the standard justification for a very long period before the 17th century. And in the 17th century, because of the rise of modern science, a theological justification of that kind is just not convincing. So, new kinds of justification had to be given for the state. And the turn was away from theology, which is the standard justification, divine things, to what I would call political psychology. Now, why do I say political psychology? Here's why. What we're seeking is justification for the state, because the theological justification has lapsed. Seeking a justification for this. In the 17th century, just about when the skepticism about theological justifications was surfacing, a new form of entity had emerged after the Westphalian peace. And there were two developments. There was the rise of science, which gave rise to skepticism about old theological justifications. Then there was the rise of a new entity after the Westphalian peace. The first time, the notion of a nation, the fact of a nation, emerged after the Westphalian peace, mid-17th century. And this, in tandem with the rise of this, became more and more centralized. Sorry about this ghastly scribble, just have to squint and read. So, you have a centralized state. So power for centuries was very scattered in its location. Little princes, ducats, so on and so forth. It got more and more centralized after the Westphalian peace. Remember, the first nationwide tax was imposed by Cromwell in England. Otherwise, people paid duties here and there, little tributes to local powers. So in the 17th century, we're looking for a new justification for this, and this had emerged. And what happened was that these emerged in tandem, and they began to be conjoined in a single concept, which came to be characterized with a hyphen. A little later, but the idea was that this locution of nation-state is actually comes later, but the phenomenon of a centralized state being fused with the nation began in the mid-17th century. So, what was being sought was a justification of this. As it was fused with this, with a hyphen here. And the justification was as follows. And this is why I call it not a theological justification, but a justification I can't do better than describe it as political psychology. You'll see why. The idea was to justify this by creating in the populace a feeling for this. That's why I call it political psychology, a political psychological justification. And you could do it because it was completely fused by this conjunction. So justifying the state in the face of the lapse of theology, the rise, say, psychology, this was justified by creating an affect, a feeling for this, which in the 17th century had become fused, or beginning to get fused, got more and more fused over the next 2 centuries. So, the question arises, what was the method by which this feeling was created for this, thereby justifying this because these were fused notions? How was this feeling generated? Everywhere in Europe, it was generated by the following method. You find an external enemy within the territory. Within the territory, an external enemy. It's within the territory. You despise it, you subjugate it, and you say, the nation is ours, not theirs. Everywhere in Europe, this method is deployed. You find an external enemy. You suppress the enemy, you hate the enemy, and you say the nation is ours, not theirs. Thereby creating a feeling for this, justifying this in the political psychology ground. This is the history of Europe. The Jews, the Irish, the Catholics of Protestant countries, the Protestants of Catholic countries. The standard method, all of them. That's the history of Europe. Now, when numerical and statistical forms of discourse emerged in the study of society, these began to be called notions of majority and minority. These began to be called minorities. And the method came to be called majoritarianism. The method of despising the minority, saying the nation is ours, not theirs, came to be called majoritarianism. And since the criterion by which minorities and majorities were distinguished was very often religious, it came to be called religious majoritarianism. Now, when this happened, there were obviously minoritarian backlashes to it. Minorities were not going to just take it sitting. So there were minoritarian backlashes to it. That created a general civil strife in which religion was playing a major role. In the strife, it was religious conflict, religious strife. When the minorities began to fight back. So there was general religious strife, because both majorities and minorities were now. And so it began to be felt that the problem is this. And this should be ushered out of having any direct influence on the polity. That's secularism. That's the origins of secularism. It's the origins of secularism, and it's a European origin. And it emerged to repair the damage generated by nation-building exercises in order to legitimate the state when theological legitimations had lapsed. That's the genealogy of secularism. European history. To repair a certain damage caused by term that came to be used later. But this process was exactly started from the mid-17th century on. That's the origins of secularism. Now, let's come back to India. In the discovery of India, Jawaharlal Nehru said, basically, repeating Gandhi's views. It's very interesting. Discovery of India is undoubtedly Nehru's deepest book. It may be the only good book Nehru wrote. Nehru was not a very original thinker. Nehru was a great man, especially now he seems like a godlike saint. But Nehru was not a very original thinker. You got things from the Fabian Society, you got things from Gandhi. Discovery of India, which the left thinks is Nehru's worst book, is actually his best book. And it was highly influenced by Gandhi. And basically repeating what Gandhi said in any number of dispatches, for Najivan and Young India, speeches and letters and so on. So, Nehru and Gandhi, Nehru especially in Discovery of India, and Gandhi in any number of cases, said, look, we've never had this damage. If secularism emerged to repair a certain damage, we've never had this damage. Just read Gandhi's writings or Nehru's Discovery of India. So everywhere, I'll use a word that Nehru used, Indian history was defined by an unself-conscious pluralism. This is Nehru's phrase describing Gandhi's position about how to think about India's past, cultural past. And everywhere, India was defined by unself-conscious pluralism. Both words are very important. And this was never damaged by these nation-building exercises, etc. So, secularism just wasn't something that was pressing on anybody's mind. That was Gandhi and Nehru's understanding of India's past. So no wonder they didn't talk much about secularism. Look at this, it's just hardly any mention of it. Until quite late in the freedom struggle. So, even Nehru this is. So now let's ask, well, if European nationalism created the damage which secularism was brought in to repair in Europe, and that damage had never been created there, what was Gandhi and Nehru's nationalism if it was not European nationalism? And Gandhi and Nehru's nationalism aspired, whether it succeeded or not is another point, but it aspired to the idea that this unself-conscious pluralism, we weren't patient with. We're talking about the 3 decades before the beginning of the So here was this national movement, one of the most fantastically creative periods in Indian history. There's nothing like it in Indian history. So here was this movement, it had many strands and so on, and Nehru's and Gandhi's position was, our nationalism is anti-imperialism, and that anti-imperial mobilization, which is our nationalism, will reflect this pluralism in it. Everybody will be involved. So, since the main jhagda is about Hindus and Muslims, right? That's the standard religious conflict that we live through. Caste is another issue, it's a completely separate issue. Very, very complex and difficult issue. But on the religious, Gandhi and Nehru insisted that the Muslims should not be should be included in the mobilization. And the most striking movement and moment, which was quite an extended moment, in which this was done, was the Khilafat. Now there's a completely implausible, in fact I would say sort of idiotic view that I've heard. Javed Naqvi wrote an op-ed and Javed Akhtar, two Javeds. Javed Akhtar has also said it's preposterous that this was a reactionary movement which created Muslim parochialism and chauvinism and identitarian Muslim. Sheer nonsense. This was one of the most progressive movements in the history of freedom struggle. It mobilized Muslims, it mobilized Kisan, the poor Muslims, not the Muslims that Jinnah stood for. Jinnah stood for the careerist Muslim from Lucknow and other urban centers who were looking for jobs and didn't want to be dominated by Hindus getting all the jobs in cities. Sheer careerism. The careerist middle-class Muslim is what the Muslim League stood for. Look, I completely agree with Aisha Jalal and all that Jinnah was not wanting a second nation, that he was bargaining for power sharing, that he was bargaining for provincial autonomy. All that is correct. But Jinnah was not a representative of ordinary poor Muslims. He stood for the relatively well-heeled, job-aspiring Muslim of centers like what Nehru and Gandhi aspired to was, through movements like this, and later on, the Muslim Mass Contact Program in the late 30s, which nobody knows, nobody studies. Bashir Hassan has one essay on it, which is actually quite a shallow essay, but again, at least it focuses on it. Very well done study. If any of you are looking for a PhD topic, the Mass Contact Program in the late 1930s is a terrific thing to go to archives for. I don't know where exactly the archives would be, probably the Security Archives at the GNU and the Nehru Memorial Library must have archives on Muslim Mass Contact Program. It's very well done study. But those were two great moments of mass mobilization of Muslims. And the history is very well worth studying because the Khilafat movement had a tremendously dynamic effect in all sorts of different regions. All the way up in Assam, in Bihar, in Bengal, it was extraordinary what effect it had. Making Muslims progressive, making Muslims vote for women's suffrage, which Muslims never ever wanted to do because their women weren't Pardha, they were very anxious that they wouldn't go out and vote because they were in Pardha. So, but Muslims voted for women's suffrage in the Bengal Provincial Assembly, thanks to the dynamism of this, which mobilized them in mass numbers. So the influence of the Khilafat movement was basically for most of the 20s. From roughly 28 to 38, when the mass contact movement was started by Nehru, this was Gandhi's movement basically. Nehru and K.M. Ashraf started the mass contact movement. K.M. Ashraf was its leader. And the idea was, look, since the late 20s, up to the late 30s, Muslims were demoralized, alienated, because all they had going for them were roundtable conferences, negotiations around tables like this for how to improve their quota in representation and so on and so forth. But it was all done around tables. It was negotiation in the formal sense between leaders. It was not mass mobilization. And when Nehru and Gandhi realized, especially Nehru, realized this is not working. Muslims are getting more and more demoralized because they are always dominated around the table by the Hindu representatives of the Hindus. We must mobilize them in masses again, because that's when they really were anti-imperialist at their strongest. Jinnah just ceased being an anti-imperialist after the late 20s. Just completely ceased. He hated the Khilafat movement. He saw that his leadership of the Muslims was being taken away from him by Gandhi, by the massification of Muslim politics. And so he just recoiled slowly and basically gave up on anti-imperialism. All he was concerned was, how do I get the best for Muslims at the end of the freedom struggle? It's not obvious that Ambedkar was anti-imperialist after a certain point. He had the same thing for the Dalits. So the anti-imperialism was basically left to Nehru and Gandhi and to much of the left. And they didn't always see eye to eye. And very often the peasants didn't see eye to eye with the Congress. Went off on some leftist jab of their own, which was quite remarkable and courageous and admirable. So, and didn't follow Gandhi and Nehru, told them to go to him, on many occasions. Nehru and Gandhi didn't have control of some of the left movement, especially in the 30s. So what we've got to understand is that Gandhi and Nehru had these moments of real pluralism reflected in the mobilizations for the nationalism they were committed to, which was anti-imperialism. That they were channeling this, bringing in both major religious populations into the national movement. They tried. The fact of partition means they failed. But nevertheless, that was the aspiration. Okay. So, there is, if you have no damage, if the very idea of a nation is not the European idea, if the very idea of nationalism is not the European, its damage, that explains why secularism never surfaced in the rhetoric of any national leader until the mid-40s. When, with the impending partition and all the real sort of conflicts of intellectual conflicts and social religious conflicts around it began to surface in people's speeches, especially Gandhi's, but especially Nehru's. Okay, that's my diagnosis of why there was. It's not a. Now I'll come back to what secularism meant after independence, in the very judicial, narrow legal sense that began to be generated, thanks to Nehru and Ambedkar's constitutional efforts to reform Hindu law, and this is after Gandhi's death. And so obviously secularism emerged because, but in a very narrow legal sense, reform of Hindu law was clearly the site where obviously made a difference. So I'll come back to that. But now, if I'm right, secularism became urgent and important, I will tell you, not till the 1980s. Now, let me say something against, let let me raise a challenge to myself, because no doubt this is occurring to many of you. You might say, but wait a minute, surely the European-style nationalism was there because there was a Mahasabha element in the Congress. There was Savarkar's book, Hindutva. There was emerging RSS, or paramilitary propaganda organizations. How can you deny, somebody might say, that European nationalism had a foothold in India? But any place, any continent, any subcontinent, any nation has different strands of the understanding of the nation, different strands of nationalism. India had the Gandhi-Nehru Congress nationalism. It developed with the emergence of Iqbal and Jinnah and so on, developed a Muslim strand. There was the left nationalism, which was not Gandhi and Nehru's nationalism. Nehru was a sort of ambiguous figure for 2-3 years in the 30s, who was a real radical. It started backpedaling. And it was done this sort of social reform, social legislative reform, not social reform in the Arya Samaj sense, but social legislative reform, nationalism of America. So all these strands of nationalism were there. But there is no doubt that the Gandhi-Nehru nationalism was dominant. There's no doubt about it. In fact, B.T. Randive was supposed to have said, somebody was telling me, I think Prof. or somebody was telling me recently, B.T. Randive said, it's amazing that the left was just swallowed up by Gandhi and Nehru. It's amazing that we had any identity about it. That was a juggernaut, the Congress nationalism. Gandhi had made it a mass politics. He had this absurd halo of popularity around him through all sorts of remarkably innovative and actually perverse and preposterous methods. The renunciatory saints, this, that, and the other, all sorts of things. Tapping popular religion, tapping all sorts of things. There's no denying it was the dominant strand. The idea that there were these other things and so on that were dominant is absurd. They just were not dominant. And I think historians have to make a distinction between antecedents and roots. So Javed Naqvi and Javed Akhtar say this was the root of Shahabuddin, the Delhi Imam, people like that in the 80s. This was the root. And Shahrukh Savarkarji and so on and so forth, and Savarkar are the roots of this China government today. Right? So, but I think historians don't make enough of a distinction between roots and antecedents. For something to be the roots of something, you have to have historical, detailed tracing of an organic path from the root to the flower. Nobody has shown that this these two evil geniuses sitting in Delhi have had their roots coming in from the Mahasamite element in the Congress. Who's shown that the organic cause of that? Who has shown it? Not one historian has shown it. What is not deniable is that there were antecedents, there were unresolved issues. That's fine. But the roots of what we see today were established in the 80s. We were not going as far back as that. There were antecedents earlier. There were unresolved issues earlier. But the roots of what we see now started in the 80s. And started for all sorts of reasons, and I'm going to just mention two. The first reason was that with the Mandal Commission and its absolutely justified proposals, there was a complete democratization of politics in India, which is remarkable. Castes which hitherto had not had any real power or privilege began to surface with some power and privilege. That's democracy. People who are powerless get some power. That's a substantive notion of democracy. It doesn't mean just going and voting, but it gives you the so-called Mandalization of Indian politics. So they're absolutely salutary to a large extent, and there are obviously flaws in it. Now, when this happened, when politics began to be democratized in this way, it was democratized in a way that can be very specifically characterized, which is showing that Hindu society was, Indian society, Hindu society, was deeply divided by caste. It revealed the fact that Hinduism was a deeply divided religious culture by caste. And in order to unify what was emerging as the truth, which is a deeply divided culture, in order to combat that and present it as a unified Hinduism, Hindu religious culture, they began to find an external enemy within in a serious way. It was absolutely determined. They created cultural organizations. The Vishwa Hindu Parishad emerged. All of these things became a very concerted effort to fight the effects of Mandal, which had shown Indian society to be deeply divided by caste. To unify what was being exposed as deeply divided, this European nationalism began to be built. And that is when the relevance of secularism, exactly as it was in Europe, emerged. But we are now obsessively talking about secularism for the last 40 years. It's very different from what happened here. Okay, that's one reason why secularism laid its roots in the 80s. The other reason is something that, if you're honest, you will have to admit, that the Hindu right showed some courage during the emergency. The centre-left, which was much more powerful than the Hindu right, the Jansan had 2-3 seats or something in parliament. The centre-left, which was much more powerful, lay down like doormats for Sanjay Gandhi and his mother to stamp on them and stamp on the liberties of this country. The Hindu right showed some courage. As a result, they gained the moral high ground and respectability from the 80s up. I mean, it started in the late 70s, but its effects were felt in the 80s, where in the parliamentary field, people began to say, okay, this is not just some horrible ultranationalist position. They're showing some central, motivating, honorable courage. And they began to gain a high ground and respectability in the parliamentary field. Huge numbers of BJP seats emerged after this period. BJP emerged after this period. The Johnson. So these are the factors which laid roots of European nationalism in the 80s. And that is why, since the 80s, we have become more and more concerned, quite rightly, with secularism. Okay, we have a little more time? Yeah? Okay, so
10 minutes here.
I need to erase that. Let me then go to the more. So this is oh, I see. Okay, I'll use this. Ah. But now let's look at secularism, not in its genealogical sense and in its broad ideological sense, but what its origins were, when it became relevant to India, when it wasn't, etc. Let's look at post-independent secularism, which was introduced as a legal doctrine in the polity, basically surrounding the efforts by the state to reform Hindu law. All sorts of issues, testamentary, personal law, Muslim law was not touched, as you know, for reasons that we can get into. But Hindu law was the central concern initially. And if you look at what happened, right, Ambedkar was a major figure in this, Nehru was a major figure in this. There were setbacks which made Ambedkar very angry. But finally, it went through, mostly because of Nehru's tremendous personality in the parliament and his influence in the parliament, which Ambedkar never had, but Ambedkar stood for the view that the secularist legal doctrine in a very remarkable and dogged and determined way. How shall we characterize the secularism? It is exactly the same secularism as European secularism. So, what is the view that I'm proposing? So I said that this is my second view. The view I'm proposing is thank you. The view I'm proposing is this is the second other Christian view. The view I'm opposing is secularism is equidistant neutrality. I mean, the basic issue is always in the Muslim. I'll put it more general. Secularism is an equidistant neutrality between religions. This is Saint's view of Christians. I think it's completely not what happened. This was said. We should maintain a neutral distance between each religion, distinction. This was said, but it was never said to be separate. This was certainly said. In fact, if you read the Karachi Resolution of 1931, this was said explicitly. Neutrality between different religions, keep a distance from all religions, this was said, but it was never said to be separate. Never. But Sen and Radhakrishnan and infantry who follow them have, let's say, added this. Alright, so what I'll ask you to do is look at Hindu law and its reform. What were Ambedkar and Nehru, prominent chief figures in this? What were they in reform? And I would say, if you look at what happened in that period of reform, in those efforts at reform, a definition of secularism emerges, which is exactly the secularism that sought to repair the damage in Europe. And here's how I have described it in my work. The Constitution, the Indian Constitution, makes 3 commitments. Together they define secularism. The first commitment, this is what I would say Indian secularism is. And it's the same as European secularism. And it's clear from how Hindu law was reformed that this is what's going on. The first commitment, our constitutional commitment, is to freedom of religion, religious belief and practice. That's a serious and deep commitment of the Constitution. Freedom of religion. The second commitment is to principles that we are committed to as a nation, constitutionally committed to as a nation. Principles which do not mention religion or opposition to religion. Principles which do not mention religion or opposition to religion. It's got nothing to do with neutrality between religions. This is principles which make no mention of either religion or the opposite of the opposition to religion. Principles such as what? Free speech. Gender justice. No mention. Absolutely no mention of religion. Just completely general principles. So, Indian secularism begins with this commitment and this commitment. And then there's a third commitment, which is a meta commitment. Meta just means it's a commitment about these 2 commitments. That's all that meta means. It's something about. Okay? So the third is a meta commitment of the Constitution. Meta meaning it's a commitment about these 2 commitments. So I would call it a meta commitment. And this meta commitment says, if there is a clash in the society whereby the exercise of this commitment by the people, where the exercise of religious practice, etc., clashes with the constitutional commitments to these, then 2 has a lexicographical priority over 1. If 1 and 2 conflict. Right. So that's Indian secularism. That's it. That's Indian secularism. It's not neutrality between religions. This is. And one might should ask, what is this then, if it's not an alternative secularism, as said rather Christian and every salaried academic social scientist to say in India. What is this, if it's not an alternative notion of secularism from what I'm offering you? This is a constraint on how this is imposed. It says, if you are going to prioritize these principles over religious practice, if they clash, you should do it equally with all religions. But you shouldn't favor one over the other. You should do it, if Muslim religious practice clashes with this, you should make Muslims bow to this. Hindus bow to it. Sikhs, you should do it even-handed. So this is a constraint on the application of this, on the implementation of this. That's what it is. It's not an alternative version of secularism. You just have to look at constitutional practice, actual practice, and you won't say stupid things. Senator, Sen especially, is a remarkable person. I'm not saying he's stupid at all. He's somebody who I greatly admire. But you just have to look at Indian history, Constituent Assembly debates. You have to look at actual practice, and even remarkable great men make mistakes, and women make mistakes. It's just totally nothing in the evidence suggests that this is a version of secularism. This is secularism, Indian secularism, and this is not an alternative, but a constraint on how this is done, even-handedly. And we didn't do it even-handedly when we gave Muslims their own personal law. Now, why we did it, was it justified? Well, those are things we can talk about at this time. Thanks.
We could now open the floor for questions, if any. We have about 15 more minutes, so please ask questions.
Please don't be constrained to say anything. Happy to happy all of you to be persuaded by.
Thank you, Professor, for a very illustrative talk. I was wondering that how do you see the current political times where secularism we always think of in terms of constitutionalism, but it is not percolating at the site of, in the protest or in the free speech.
Say that again. Sorry.
See, so we have a constitution to practice it, as you said, but those three laws you mentioned, which comes from, but it's not percolating at the site of protest as a free speech when a citizen try to exercise his rights.
So you see, suppose an Indo-Anglian novelist writes a book trashing Islam's most cherished beliefs, right? So, suppose people start lynching Muslims for telling other something, right? You just say if it clashes with any, so somebody writes it down. MF Hussain, take MF Hussain. Then Saraswati. Bharat Mata. Sure, goddesses and skimpy dresses, clothes, right? This kicks in. The point is that it's very very important to understand that if this particular thing is much more, has been much more controversial. Gender justice. Free speech is obvious. I mean, free speech is everywhere. So far as I know, every liberal democratic constitution, ours, South Africa's, and every the United States, every European, free speech is absolutely standardly in every constitution. Something like this, which is there in our constitution, right, comes standardly against freedom, against religious practice. It's absolutely standard. It's part of the reform of Hindu law was appealing to this. So this is so obvious that one doesn't really have to discuss it because it's just routine in liberal democracy. We've committed ourselves to gender justice in the Constitution and religious practice in personal law just runs up against it all the time. So if you prioritize this, lexicographical ordering is just a term, it's actually a term in mathematics, and then got used in economics, and then John Rawls began to use it in political theory. In gender justice is much the more controversial. And what is true is that in Muslim personal law, this was not exercised. This was not exercised. As we know, they were made an exception. So, this was violent. You favored the Muslims over the Hindus. By the way, this was done in Britain on free speech. Salman Rushdie, when he wrote that novel, Satanic Verses, he was protected by the British government. When Kazantzaki had written a similar novel about Christ on the cross having homosexual fantasies, right? Mary Whitehouse led a campaign against, Christian campaign against Kazantzaki, and he was against it. So there again, this was violent. This constraint on how this is implemented was violent. And the question is also, we, in our Constitution, in the outcome of the Constituent Assembly debates, we did violate this, and we treated Hindus different, Hindu personal law differently from Muslim personal law. Now you might say that that is that just means that this is something we have never adopted. But that too is wrong. We did adopt this as a constraint on the only secularism there is. It's just that we said there was a temporal clause. It didn't specify the sunset date, but it did say that when the Muslims are ready to have the state reform its personal law, when they have the confidence to accept such a thing, it will happen. So it's not as if Muslim personal law was granted to them in the 50s as a minority right. Absolutely not. Just read. Some Muslims in the Constituent Assembly debates wanted it as a minority right. It was never granted as a minority right. It was granted as something which was completely intended as temporary, saying there will be a sunset on that exception when the Muslims are. Because what were the reasons for granting the exception? The reasons for granting the exception were, okay, Zamindari, when they lost large numbers in migration from our population. They went off to Pakistan. They lost their language. They lost their Zamindari. They lost all sorts of things. So let us give them at least their culture, which is, the personal laws where their culture is. So it was granted as, they've been so demoralized as a result of partition. Remember, we gave away Urdu to this country, Pakistan, which doesn't even speak it. They speak Punjabi, which is where it's not. Our language that Hindus and Muslims spoke in North India. Jawaharlal spoke it better than I do. I'm a Muslim. Everybody in North India, very many people in North India spoke Urdu, and people like Sampurnandan, Tandon, and so on and so forth. And UP is the absolute site where all this is decided, because UP is the center of Indian politics. And people like Sampurnandan, Tandon, and all just said, you wanted your own nation? Take your language. So a beautiful language that most North Indians spoke, and Hindus often spoke better than many Muslims, was given away as a gift to a country which doesn't even speak it by and large. Fit of nationalistic pique. Right? So they lost their language. They lost their zamindar. And they lost vast numbers of people to migration. So it was decided, hey, let them have something until they're ready to have the law. That's not in any way creating minority rights for their personal law. Not at all. It's just holding in abeyance this clause and thereby temporarily violating this, holding it in abeyance. Yeah.
Professor, I would like to briefly comment on three points that I was thinking maybe if you can elaborate upon. One is that Rajiv Bhargava says that Indian state was always principally distant from religion. So that's Rajiv Bhargava. He's a political scientist, and he says Indian's form of secularism was different from European secularism. He says, and he compares it with France, secularism in France. He says that Indian state has always taken a principled distance from religion.
That's exactly what sense is. Exactly that. Yeah.
And so the second point is that now the claim that the people or the majoritarianism makes is that India was never a secular country. Secularism was never a part of the nationalist discourse. It was only added later in 19.
Who said this?
So the majoritarian discourse is
But
always
you see,
built in that.
But I'm saying that until the 1980s. I'm saying that that's true. But so let me take your second point first. So I'm saying exactly that, but I'm not saying it because I'm a majoritarian. But I'm saying it because we did not mimic Europe until the 1980s. That's my reason for saying it. It's not the majoritarian reason for saying it. It's my reason for saying it. Now there is, what was your first point? Yeah, so, but this is Rajiv Bhargava. Yeah, but that's just sense.
Yeah, he's criticized also for that.
It's absolutely typical. This, as I told you, all of them say it now. Everybody says it. But it's just look at the reform of law, look at how it was done, and you have this definition. Of course, there's an exception, but that exception is not in the form of a minority right. So this is the same Radhakrishnan and all these other people's views. It's just simply, yeah.
So post-1980s, post-Shah Banu case, the Uniform Civil Code, the entire discourses, what the feminists have been arguing for, was overtaken by the Hindu majoritarian discourse. So that's when the feminists also they distance themselves from that for argument in the favor of Uniform Civil Code. How do you see that?
Well, I think the whole Shah Banu case was bringing to a head these issues of how to apply the meta principle to this. It was, people were taking different strands on it, and it was very badly manipulated by the government. Rajiv Gandhi played a very bad role, and don't forget the Ayodhya issue was also around the corner. These were all very, very touchy, affective issues. And the Congress Party played a very bad role. The Congress Party is, it's always going to lose because it has to pretend to be secular while doing all this, and the BJP doesn't have to pretend anything. Okay.
Just do one. Thank you, Professor. Just one comment I wanted on this. Like we are living in a polarized time, so we are seeing the rise of reactionary forces from the Hindu fold, and there is a reactionary tendency in the Muslim community too, in terms of political articulation. And not saying in the sense of condemnation, that's a natural reaction in terms of political unfolding. But how difficult or what future do you see in terms of the forces like left in organizing in such situations? Not the left who has completely surrendered in the neoliberal logic, but the left which is still dedicated to...
The left?
Who has surrendered in the neoliberal logic for running a government, but the left...
The left is dead in the water. What are you talking about? Where is the left? Look, there is no left except in Kerala. There's no left except in Kerala. And in Kerala too, they pursue neoliberal economic policies, which is what made them lose in Bengal. The pursuit of neoliberal policies. So let's not talk about the left. It's a very depressing story. There's just no left outside of Kerala. And in fact, people in Delhi and Bengal, the left in Delhi and Bengal should be focusing on Kerala, completely focusing on Kerala. They should never allow the Congress or any other party to win in Kerala, because they always did. They always went from one to the other. But the left should focus on Kerala and forget about the rest of the country. They have no chance. They get less than 4% of the vote.
Still, what future do you see for the secular forces in organizing?
Okay, so let's talk about the secular forces and not about the left. And the secular forces, you see, it's very interesting. If you look at, suppose you take this argument and you say, unself-conscious pluralism had a self-conscious articulation in Europe in the 60s, 70s, 80s, called multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is pluralism, but it's much more self-consciously articulated, whereas this was just life. This was life all through Indian history. Right? You articulated it as a doctrine called multiculturalism, to deal with migration problems from the erstwhile colonies to European nations. It emerged as a doctrine. So you might ask, today, why isn't multiculturalism more important than secularism? Right? Multiculturalism is the idea that you allow this much more freedom and constrain it very little by this. Right? People have their own Sharia law. People have, if somebody believes in blasphemy, then you let them, censor blasphemers and so on and so forth. Right? That's what they're demanding in Europe. They say, you can't just go around blaspheming against Islam and so on. All right. So you can ask, why don't we do that in India today instead of secularism? That's much more fair to the Muslims and so on. Maybe it's more fair, but it's a stupid, impossible dream. You think the kind of Hindutva nationalism that has taken the holds of the popular mind in all sorts of countries. I speak to taxi drivers and so on. Every one of them say Tarakki ho rahi hai, Ram Temple ban raha. Everywhere they say it's just part of the popular. And when you have that, then multiculturalism is an impossible dream. And the people in Shaheen Bagh, the wonderful people, mostly women actually, many women, Muslim women, who occupied that Maidan and several other Maidans and streets in many, even small towns in this country 3 winters ago, they actually were standing up for secular citizenship. They were not asking for multiculturalism. They said we have a constitution, we have a commitment to this. Just give us our citizenship, equal citizenship. They merely demanded secular citizenship. The idea that we should have our own laws in a country with an atmosphere of this ethos of this kind is a completely crazy dream to have. You're never going to get anywhere near that dream. So all you have to do is do what those remarkable young people did 3 winters ago. Demand, out on the streets, in the Maidans, which COVID brought to an end, unfortunately. Demanding what? Just equal citizenship, what the Constitution wants. What is very fascinating is that those wonderful young people appeal to a very multicultural ethos in their posters and in their poetry and in their mushairas and all which they held. It was charmingly multicultural, but their demands were abstract secular citizenship. And that combination of things was very fascinating. Also worth studying. That is, the methods by which they protested were in fact pluralist and multicultural in the Indo-Persian cultural sense. But what they were demanding was a very modernist secular citizenship. So that combination of method and goal is actually quite dissonant and very well studied, that dissonance. Okay, I've got to go somewhere else.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Bilgrami, for accepting our invitation. I thank you all on behalf of APPSC for joining us. I request APPSC members to present Professor with a small token of our appreciation.
I'm so happy to have this. Thank you very much. It's great. Thanks.